Welcome to the Palestine Chronicles in depth. I'm Robert Inlakesh, and today we'll be talking to renowned author and journalist Dr. Ramzy Baroud, also the editor of Palestine Chronicle. We will be discussing Israel's invasion of Rafah, the reality of the Palestinian resistance on the ground, and much, much more, debunking the Israeli propaganda surrounding the attack on Gaza's southernmost city.
So I wanted to start off by talking to you about the initial invasion of Rafah, which was this penetration on May 6 into around 3 kilometers deep into the border area with Egypt and the seizure of the Rafah crossing, which was, of course, involving the Jabati Brigade and the 401st Battalion or Brigade of the Israeli military. What was interesting there was, despite the fact that they were sent for such a sensitive mission, this brigade on the Rafah crossing, they behaved in a way which we have seen other soldiers filming these videos of themselves destroying property. And this is in such a sensitive area because of the fact that the Camp David Accords of 1979, the deal between Egypt and Israel, which normalized ties, essentially was crushed by this move of the Israelis entering what is known as the Salahuddin or Philadelphia corridor. What do you make of that initial invasion?
If we just look back prior to that date, you will find that the Rafah story has been consistently linked to everything that Israel has done in Gaza. I know it may appear like Rafah came later on in Israel's calculation, since the invasion began somewhere between the east and north, Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, then other parts, then moved to the center. They failed in Maghazi and Bureij. They retreated. They attacked Khan Yunis. They were there for a few weeks. Then they went back to the north. And it seemed like Rafah was left until the very end, but it's actually not true. Rafah has always been part of the Israeli strategic and military calculation from the very start. We know that because one of the first actions that they have carried out was bombing the Rafah crossing from the Palestinian side more than once. And that prompted Egypt to shut down the crossing, which was the proper thing to do. I mean, when an army that is, bombing a border crossing, you're not going to allow people in and out. So the Rafah crossing became open for very specific reasons, for very specific people and missions. But as a functional border crossing for Palestinians to leave and return freely, it was no longer relevant. So that was the very start of the Rafah component of the story. Then later on, you start hearing Israeli military strategists, ex-generals, or even current officials talking about we must reoccupy the Philadelphia corridor. Now, we know that there was an agreement sometime between 2000 or sometimes in 2005, where the Israelis have decided with the Egyptians and the Palestinian Authority that we are going to vacate that stretch of land separating Rafah from Egypt in favor of the Palestinian Authority kind of taking over that side of the crossing, but in total collaboration with Israel. In other words, if you or I or anybody needed to go through that crossing, the information would be sent to the Israelis. The Israelis would process it, would send it back saying allow and don't allow. So effectively, Israel was in charge of the Rafah crossing without raising an Israeli flag on top of the crossing. And they have done so with the total knowledge and consent and cooperation of Egypt and the Palestinian Authority. After the Hamas victory in the elections and the clash resulting from the outcome of those elections between Hamas and Fatah, you saw that Hamas became the de facto power controlling the crossing. Of course, Israel didn't like that. Thus, the very tight siege imposed on Gaza, not just by Israel, but also by Egypt as well, with the total support and financing of the United States. So Rafah has always been part of that story, a very, very important part. Now, what the Israelis are talking about is that there are tunnels, the tunnels. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that tunnels do exist in this large stretch that goes all the way from the sea all the way to Karam Abu Salim, crossing all the way into Israel. It makes no sense why the crossing itself would be the first target for the Israeli army. It would make no sense of why Israeli soldiers are raising the Givati flag and the Israeli flag, the largest flag you have seen since the start of the war, on top of the main building of the Rafah crossing. This was a political message. This was not a military message. It was a political message. Number one, it was a message to Egypt that we have pushed the reset button and we do not respect any agreement that has been signed, either regarding Camp David or the addendums to Camp David, and finally to what has taken place after the Hamas takeover. We are back to square one. The second message was to the Israeli extremists who have been demanding the takeover of Philadelphia corridor. And the reason they wanted to take over the Philadelphia corridor or the Salah ad-Din roundabout is because they wanted to make sure that Israel is back in Gaza for good. That was the main demand of Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and all others. That's what they wanted. And that's what Netanyahu is trying to give them. That this is my commitment to you, that this is not a hit and run kind of military operation. We are there to stay, and in order for you to stay, you have to completely suffocate the Palestinians within the boundaries of Gaza. And the Salah ad-Din or the Philadelphia corridor was the last line of defense, supposedly in their mind, in the hands of the Palestinians. But of course, it's all hogwash because the crossing was closed anyway. Israel was the one controlling the aid in and out of Gaza anyway. Israel had effective political control over the crossing through the pressure placed by the United States on Egypt anyway. So it's not going to change anything as far as Israel's power or control or return to Gaza is concerned. And we also know that the vast majority, if not all of the tunnels connecting the Sinai Desert to Gaza have been destroyed. We know that because the Egyptians have worked with the Americans in exchange for a very large and handsome sum of money to destroy them. The CIA was involved, the various American intelligence units were directly involved. They were not urging Egypt from Washington to do so. They were themselves in Sinai working with the Israelis, with the Egyptians, with the Americans to ensure that the tunnels are not functional. How does the resistance get its weapons and its supplies and that sort of thing? Well, that was the main reasons of why, or one of the main reasons of why the Palestinians began creating their own weapons and a very effective arsenal at that. If the tunnels continue to be porous and open, most likely the resistance in Gaza would have not developed the kind of weaponry and the kind of cachet that exists in Gaza right now. So I think this is really all done to send political messages as opposed to military messages. And I think the resistance knew that. And I think this is why the resistance allowed them to kind of pretty much effectively control at least operationally, control the Philadelphia corridor, because it really did not have the most strategic value for the resistance, but it had value for the Egyptians. Because that was the red line that the Egyptians have been creating since the beginning of the war. The red line hasn't been taking over Khan Yunis or Bureij or Jabali. The red line has been stay away from the Philadelphia corridor. Do not jeopardize Camp David. Do not put us in a position where we are going to be in a defensive position. But Israel crossed all of these lines and humiliated Egypt beyond the humiliation that pre-existed all of this. So really the ball is now in the Egyptian court. Are you going to continue this episode of humiliation? Are you going to take action or not? It's something that Egypt would have to answer.
Well, it's interesting because back in January, when the Israelis started making a noise about invading Rafah, because, of course, as you know, this has been months and months of them threatening and talking about how they're going to go into Rafah and the US Biden administration drawing up its red lines and then rescinding those red lines and then going back and placing different red lines and then contradicting themselves and saying that there aren't those specific so-called red lines. But now what we see is that the Egyptians are put in that position where either they have to act now or they will forever stay silent, because this is essentially tearing up their normalization agreement with the Israelis. And not only that, we saw that an Egyptian soldier was killed a few days ago. So it's not like the Egyptians have been the aggressor here or they've done something wrong. And on top of that as well, the fact that now the Rafah crossing is actually taken by the Egyptians is something that the Israelis no longer can use as their propaganda talking point, because before they said, well, we don't control Rafah. But of course, as you said, for the pressure that they exerted on the Egyptian regime before, they essentially did control what came through Rafah and what could not come. And that's why there was such a crisis in aid coming in. But now they've seized the crossing itself. The way I wanted to take this conversation now is sort of looking at, before we go further into Rafah itself and the various massacres and what's going on, is this whole idea, and you touched on it briefly, that Rafah is somehow of great strategic value to the Israelis in this war, which they say is targeting Hamas. This is their narrative. Initially, just to set this the stage for this, initially we heard that the Shifa hospital was the Hamas headquarters after the Israelis invaded and blew up Gaza City and released all of these CGI videos for us to see these alleged Hamas headquarter tunnels underneath Shifa, and that wasn't there. They then pivoted quickly and started talking about Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is now the real headquarters of Hamas. I think that was actually said by Israeli officials. That's the real headquarters, that's their quotes. And then after that, in around January, after Khan Yunis was besieged, the city itself, they had invaded the Nasser hospital as well, or they were setting up the invasion of the Nasser hospital. Then we heard about Rafah. Can you tell us why it will not be militarily effective to invade Rafah, and why Israel really wants to invade fully? Of course, they've already entered.
When the war started, all the talks were about Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun in the furthest north in Gaza. The reason be it, the logic, the military logic, and maybe it does make sense, or it made sense at the time, is that the tunnels used by the resistance connecting Gaza to Israel most likely go from the closest possible point of populated Palestinian areas or towns and cities into Israel, and that naturally would have to be Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun. We stopped hearing about Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun not only as soon as they were taken over, but even though now they are back. Actually, most of the resistance, most of the so-called complex operation carried out by the resistance happening in these areas. But the Israelis don't talk about it anymore. So what did you do exactly in Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun after October 7? What is it? What kind of military you destroyed everything in your wake. You killed thousands of people and you pushed everyone out, but the resistance is still there. The nature of Palestinian resistance is somewhere between guerrilla warfare and a very unique military tactic that we haven't seen before. I don't accept the term guerrilla warfare and what's going on. Yes, there's that aspect to it, but there is another aspect similar to one that happened in Jabalia only a few days ago, where they were able to intercept, watch very carefully the movement of various Israeli military vehicles moving in Jabalia. Then they attacked them. They blew up a Shawad, I believe, explosive device when they were trying to go inside, kind of search inside this destroyed building. Then they engaged with them again. Then more soldiers came to take the bodies or the wounded of the previous unit that was attacked in Jabalia. And then they attacked them again and they blew up that force as well. Then the following day, a large number of Israeli soldiers came and they tried to kind of assess the situation. 3 of them were snipes, 2 in a single bullet, right? We all watched this video. And a lot of us maybe are watching that video are not paying attention to the duration of that video. That operation lasted for about 16 hours, okay, anywhere between 12 to 16 hours. Within that period of time, guerrilla warfare, you would have hit and run a long time ago. They are there. They are watching. They are intercepting. They are aware of your community. They are even aware of the identities of the officers who are in that area. So this is a type of operation that means, and I will link this to Rafah in a second. It means that the resistance is fighting a different kind of war, a mix between various tactics. It's not a war of position per se, because they can't stay in that position or take over another line of defense, or and stay there for weeks. But in some areas they are. In Jabalia they are. The Israelis are attacking from 4 different areas in Jabalia, and they cannot break the first line of defense of the resistance because the elite units of Al-Qassam is fighting there. That's a war of position. So you have guerrilla warfare, you have a war of, a tactical war, you have a war of position, all of it happening at the same time. Now imagine people who are that clever. Love them, hate them, that's not the issue. But if they are that good at what they do, the resistance, do you think that they would have been sitting since January and even earlier, listening to the Israelis saying, no, Rafah is the problem. Rafah is the place we must attack. The leadership is in Rafah. Then more and more voices join in. And by the end, there is this total consensus in the Israeli government, military, intelligence, saying Rafah is the main issue. And a resistance that fights with that such fluidity would have been just sitting there, I don't know, doing shisha, or just sitting and just waiting for the Israelis to come in. It doesn't make any sense. And the Israelis themselves know it doesn't make any sense. The nature of the fluidity of the resistance, and the fact that they are not operating above ground anyway, it means that they can be in Khan Yunis now, they can be in Rafah later. We have seen various units of Al-Qassam and Al-Quds brigades joining, fighting together, joining the resistance together. Then you have the socialists joining in the Qassam in the central part of Gaza. They are playing a very clever and long-term game. To come and say that they are in Rafah, those who are not aware of the nature of the Palestinian resistance and tactics used, and those who don't understand the geography of Gaza, are actually under the impression, or they want to give us the impression, at least within Washington, that there are units of Palestinian resistance just sitting and waiting. That concept doesn't exist in Gaza. It never existed in Gaza. So Hamas is not in Rafah. Hamas is everywhere. And they are everywhere they feel that they need to be there for their strategic objectives out of this war. But the reason I think ultimately Israel attacked Rafah is because they couldn't find victory anywhere else. They searched for victory in the rubbles of Khan Yunis, in Nusayrat, in the Gaza Valley. They established this Netzarim area, but instead they created this situation in which they are sitting ducks for the resistance to shoot from both sides of that so-called buffer zone they created, and they have to leave sooner or later, and so forth. So Rafah became the last front line for this failed military war genocide expedition of Israel. But what is so interesting, though, is the kind of political discourse that Israel has affiliated with that particular battle. That if we lose Rafah, we lose everything. If we win Rafah, we win everything. Is there one single intelligent military analyst that can actually verify any kind of credibility to that statement? So Netanyahu has linked Rafah to the existence of the Jewish people, not just of Israel. Why? What's the military logic of that? It makes zero sense. But because the Israelis are shielded from actual good information, they are pushing out every possible organization that could provide a different viewpoint of what's happening. They are blocking the Palestinian resistance videos from reaching Israeli society and that sort of thing. At the end of the day, many Israelis are just going along thinking that there is going to be some victory of Rafah in Rafah. But if the victory was not found in northern Gaza, in Shuja'iyya, Zaytun, Sheikh Radwan, and Jabalia, why would you find it in Rafah at the Philadelphia crossing or corridor? It just makes no sense.
And this information being hidden from the Israeli soldiers themselves is to their own detriment. For instance, them looking at the videos released by the various resistance factions, of which there's around 11 of them that are consistently fighting. There's other small groups that are there as well, even beyond that, if you're going to look into the divisions within certain smaller armed factions. None of them, to any of our knowledge, they're still putting out videos, all these small factions. None of them have been defeated. So it's not just Hamas. They talk about defeating Al-Qassam in the north, but they haven't defeated Saraya al-Quds. They haven't defeated Abu Ali Mustafa brigades. They haven't defeated Kata'ib Shuhada al-Aqsa of the Fatah movement either. So they haven't defeated any of these groups. It doesn't appear like they've significantly weakened many of these groups even. And if the Israelis were actually exposed to the videos of what was happening, I don't think they would accept their death toll figure as well for their armed forces. They put it at, I think, around 261 was the new statistic today of soldiers they say have died officially that they've released in the battles ongoing in the Gaza Strip. But I think from the videos that we've seen from the resistance factions alone, we've seen evidence that way more than that have been killed. And then we see these contradicting figures coming out from Israeli media as well. And so the lies for the Israeli side is actually to their own detriment, because if they were watching the resistance videos and they were actually following up on what the course of the battle is actually looking like, maybe they would change their tactics, like stopping, sitting in windows, waiting for themselves to be sniped, or receive a thermobaric warhead into the building. Basic mistakes, which a lot of military analysts that I know are screaming from the rooftops about why are they doing this. And there's also the problem with them as well that they haven't received adequate training sometimes, and they throw these soldiers into certain areas. And so we're looking at a situation now where, and I would like to get your comment on this, Al-Qassam was able to still fire rockets at Tel Aviv. It was able to announce that it had captured an Israeli soldier, it looked like from a special forces unit in Jabalia, despite the fact that the Israeli military said that they had essentially wiped out Hamas in the north. In Jabalia has been one of the largest battles of the entire war so far. Israel is claiming to have, that Rafah is the final step to victory. When they go in, how are they going to come out of that looking as if they have pulled off a victory? And then what is next? Are they looking for, some people have suggested, an ethnic cleansing of the population? That doesn't look likely, just because of the fact that now geographically the people have been pushed north of Rafah. Where do they go from here? And how do you read the tactics of the resistance some 8 months now into this war?
Just to put things in perspective regarding the number of Israeli soldiers killed, and now the Israelis, of course, are lying. We know that they are lying not because it's just common sense. I mean, it makes no sense that their numbers can be true when we are every single day. I mean, we are inundated of videos showing Israeli tanks, personnel carriers. I mean, we know how many people, for example, Merkava tank can accommodate up to 15 people inside. But some analysts say, well, let's assume it's anywhere between 9 and 12, which is also possible. And when you have a tank that blows up fully or partially, well, the people inside are gonna, and we don't see them coming running out, right? Because they know that there are snipers all over the place. So we know that at least one of them would be killed, several would be injured, if not more. So the question is, how do you account for these numbers? Who's keeping the tally, right? So, but we know that over 1,500 Israeli tanks have been hit, whether fully or partially, since the start of the war. And we know that because we know that the resistance has been far more accurate, because they document their claims, while the Israelis don't. So we have no other reason but to believe the narrative of the resistance regarding what's happening. If someone is a little bit unsure, what does that actually mean? 15 or 1,500 or more Israeli tanks and military vehicles, including D9 bulldozers and personal carriers and all the rest, have been hit since the start of the war. Think about it this way: during the second Intifada, 2000 to 2005, which was an armed intifada, at least a large aspect of it was armed. Um, the total number of Israeli Merkava tanks and military vehicles that were damaged, not destroyed, because the Palestinians did not have the capabilities of destroying, but damaging. Throughout the entire 5 years was about 50. That's 10 Merkava tanks damaged within a year of each year of the Intifada. Do the math, and you will find out that within 1 week of slow days of fighting, you will find that Israel has lost within 1 week more than it has lost in an entire year of fighting during the second Intifada. The nature of Palestinian resistance has changed. We are not talking about symbolic victories. We always speak about symbolic victories because it's just the nature of resistance. You can't talk about an army that has been one of the top in the world and the leading army in the Middle East. And I think the power of the Israeli army doesn't come from the Israeli army itself, but rather it comes from the fact that it had this open channel of support coming from the United States, intelligence information and military equipment coming from the likes of Germany, Italy, Great Britain, and France, and others, now India, and many others. And they are fighting against a group of people who make their own sniper guns and their own explosives underground in complete disconnect from the rest of the world. And they are still losing at a very high number. That tells us two things. Number one, the Palestinian resistance is strong and it's adapting, and it's going to become even stronger in the future, even stronger. And the second thing is that Israel has a very, very bad army. We can have a different conversation where the Israeli army is really bad, but it is definitely bad. It is definitely bad. And that takes us back to Rafah. You are trying to create phony victories because you can't fight the real people there. So you are trying to kind of push against Egypt. And here's the sad heart of the story. The great Egyptian army that has always served as the leader of, the Arab world, the pride and joy of the Egyptian people and of the Arab people throughout decades, the army of Jamal Abdel Nasser and so forth, the people who stayed in Palestine during the Nakba, in that final battle of Fallujah in southern Palestine. That army, in Israel's point of view, is the weakest link in its military war against the Palestinians. Not because the Egyptians don't know how to fight, but because Israel is counting on the total power and dominance that America has over the Sisi regime, knowing that no matter what Israel is going to do, they're not going to go to war. So they kill their own soldiers. And by the way, I mean, if we think about this logically, we have seen Egyptian soldiers like Muhammad Salah, for example, sniping and killing several Israelis in the past, before the war, right? So if the Egyptians are the ones who are doing the attacking, we have enough evidence to tell us that most likely they would have injured at least one Israeli soldier. And the Israeli soldiers, and I've been to that border many times in the past, the Egyptians who are operating in that area, because of the fence and because of the nature of that region, they tend to be really good fighters. I wouldn't say the elites of the Egyptian army, but they are not the rank and file of the Egyptian army. So to claim that they have attacked the Israelis and did not score a single injury, while the Israelis who are in a position of defense managed to kill one or two and injure more, indicates that actually it was the Israelis who provoked this. We still don't know what happened because the Egyptians are not releasing what happened, because they don't want the reaction of a very angry Egyptian people who are frustrated with their regime and with their military for not taking action in defense of Rafah. But I just want to say this, Tal al-Sultan is not far away from the observation towers of the Egyptian army. We all have seen that massacre where 50 people Children were caught on fire. We've seen them on camera, decapitated children lying beside their moms in bed, in a tent in the Tal Sultan area in Rafah. Imagine an Egyptian soldier watching this. These are people, these are human beings first, but they are also Arabs and Muslims and neighbors, and they are an extension of the Egyptian culture that goes back a very long time ago. And they are watching this and they are being told, do absolutely nothing. You get fired at, do absolutely nothing. Palestinians are starving inside, do absolutely nothing. What is the breaking point of the Egyptian army? At this point, I don't really know. But I know that what Israel is doing is they are twisting the knife in Egypt, humiliating Egypt. Maybe they are hoping for a response. Maybe they are hoping that the Egyptian response will create a dignified way out for Netanyahu. But his victory is not in Gaza. And the Philadelphia corridor has very little to do with the resistance and the tunnels underground and that sort of thing.
And to steer this conversation into, you just mentioned the massacre which happened where Joe Biden finally got his confirmed image of a beheaded baby. So there's that for Mr. Joe Biden, who at the start of this in October said that he saw confirmed images of Hamas beheading babies. I'm paraphrasing him, which of course even then his staff at the White House had to come out and refute what he said, because of course he did not see these alleged images. We have heard from the United Nations, multiple human rights organizations, that in the event the Israelis launch a full-scale invasion of Rafah, the civilian casualties will be astronomical, and this will be a humanitarian crisis within a humanitarian crisis. To what extent do you believe that this will be a major blow to the civilian population there? And why? Why would Israel do this? You know, a lot of people are asking these questions. Why are they conducting these massacres, which haven't just happened recently in Rafah, as you know, have been happening throughout the entirety of the war?
First, regarding Biden, I think I don't blame Biden for this. I really don't. The man has been clear about his ideological affiliations with Israel. He has told us that I am a Zionist, that you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. I'm a Zionist, and we know what Zionists are made of. They are thugs. They are criminals. I mean, we just realized that Mossad has been threatening the family of Ben Souda, the former uh, prosecutor at the ICC. They are thugs. And when you come and say I am a Zionist, you are saying I am a member of this club of thugs. So for us to put expectations that Biden is going to see the silver lining or develop some sort of a moral conscience because of the decapitated babies of Rafah that we've all seen versus the fake decapitation that happened on October 7th is just not going to happen, right? On the other hand, I think the massacring of civilians has been a very important strategy for Israel, a military strategy, because they are unable to produce actual numbers of Palestinian fighters who have been killed. They are not able to produce any evidence that their war in any way is on it, at least on the way of being won. So what do? You create the kind of images that are going to satisfy your public. I really hope that people have at least a faint idea of how violent Israeli society is, how fascist Israeli society is. Quite often we keep saying Netanyahu versus, Netanyahu and Gallant versus Gantz and this, the labor versus the Likud, this and that. Israeli society is a fascist society. They have been indoctrinated to the extent that the Euromed monitor, really, when I actually heard that piece of news, I thought I have to find the source, the original source, because even based on my understanding of Israel and Israeli society, which goes back to the very start, I thought this has to be a conspiracy theory. This cannot be true. When Euromed Monitor reported that it turns out that Israeli civilians are being invited to the torture session of Palestinians in northern Gaza or in the Gaza envelope area. They bring Palestinians, they torture them to the joy and the pleasure of Israelis. I actually went, and it was Euromed Monitor reported on this based on eyewitness accounts. So when these images of Palestinians being massacred are somehow seen by Israeli society, and they do it, social media and elsewhere, with 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 another group of Israelis in their thousands chasing after trucks that are supposedly bringing aid to Palestinians through Karim Abu Salim and Eretz and all of that, setting them on fire, stealing them. This is a society that actually thrives at the suffering of the Palestinian people. You would say, Ramzy, come on, maybe you are exaggerating, or maybe this is something just linked to what happened on October 7th. They are angry. Google it. Go and find Israelis barbecuing in areas in southern Israel during previous wars, starting with Kaslid in 2008, 2009. Israelis taking their Shabbat, their weekend vacation, and going to barbecue while watching the white phosphorus being dropped on Gaza and cheering for it. There's an absolute sickness in that society. It goes even beyond fascism, because fascism is ultimately a political ideology with a specific end. But with Israel is a sickness. So when they see this, they say, well, maybe there is potential. They are torn between those who want to kill all the resistance and its infrastructure and anyone and everyone affiliated with it, which practically could be all of Gaza, and those who want to ethnically cleanse all Palestinians, and a third group who says, like the Minister of Heritage in Israel, that says, well, you can just drop a nuclear bomb. I mean, there's always an option, in which Lindsey Graham, in the American senator, responds to by saying, yes, it's an option. We've used it before. Why shouldn't the Israelis use that option? So the massacres all happen within this context, this sickness, this illness, but also the desperation and the cowardliness. You only attack a woman and a child if you're a coward. Because a real fighter fighting a real war, there is a code of honor that soldiers have, regardless of whether it's a just war or not a just war. But every battle has a code of conduct. For you to go and kill and rape women, behead children, and starve people to death, and then take their clothes and their toys and do Instagram, videos out of them and laugh at their pain, it means that you are a very sick society. That can only be an outcome of a sick government and a sick ideology. That's the logic of the Israeli massacres. They can't win on the battlefield. They take it out on civilians.
And the follow-up question to that would be, how do you see this actually concluding? Because the Israelis now, as I see it, and correct me if you believe me to be wrong here, they essentially were sidelining what they called the Gaza question or the Gaza problem. For them, the religio-fascist Israeli extremists who want to settle the West Bank specifically, these types like your Ben Gvirs and Smotrich people, these types of settlers, the West Bank is more important because of all the biblical stories which they use to justify taking it, whereas Gaza is not that desired. So they sort of pushed Gaza off to the side, tried to ignore it for a long time, periodically attacked Gaza. And then October 7 happened, and they couldn't ignore the fact that there were 2.3 million people crammed into Gaza, that there was a resistance in Gaza that had grown strong enough to attack them and collapse basically their sovereign command of their army and embarrass them in this way. So instead, obviously, there's one side, one option, which is to go towards some sort of peaceful agreement, whether that's a comprehensive agreement or a long-term truce or ceasefire agreement, and that could entail other things. Or there is the other option, which if you want to be Israel as the quote-unquote Jewish state, as defined in the nation-state law, to be only for Jewish self-determination, you cannot have all these Palestinians in the occupied territories potentially becoming part of you, or living there next to you with any sort of military power. They would never accept that. So you have to go to the other option, which is either ethnic cleansing on a mass scale or complete genocide to kill everybody. Having said that, and that's the way I see this, is that they sidelined because, and they wanted to provide that cloak of perhaps maybe there could be a deal in the future. You know, even Trump came along with his so-called deal of the century. And then they looked over Gaza and the West Bank so much that they even went forward with their so-called Abraham Accords, these normalization deals with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, they included Sudan in there, and Morocco. They thought that it was going to just be okay and they could ignore Gaza. How do you see this playing out going forward? And do you think that's accurate, what I've just set up there to some degree or another? Or would you have something to
Well,
add to that dynamic?
right. So, I mean, what you're saying is indeed what is being kind of proposed by many. I mean, we see all of these viewpoints kind of zigzagging and overlapping and all of that. But in actuality, this gives the impression that the choice is Israeli. But Israel, if it loses the war in Gaza, it loses the choice. It's as simple as that. Israel is a settler colonial society. A settler colonial society that can only exist as a settler colonial society. Now, we know that there are other settler colonial societies, like Australia, for example, that still behaves with kind of that mentality in mind, but it's not in a process of expansion, colonial expansion. It's not taking over other countries and sending their militaries to Africa. Maybe if times have changed, maybe they will resort to that sort of tactic. But the Israelis is a settler colonial society that only exists as a military power that has to obtain what Bill Clinton called back in the day in the 90s military edge over its neighbors. Hamas has stolen that military edge or has neutralized that military edge for the Israelis and therefore deprived them from their most important tool that would allow them to maintain their status as settler colonial society. If Israel loses the military option, Israel loses the very reasons of why it managed to maintain its existence throughout these years. At least that's the mindset of the Israelis. What the Palestinians have been saying all along, let's coexist. Let's find a way that we can all coexist and have equal rights and all of that. But if that happens, it's going to the very idea of Israel existing as a Jewish state for the Jewish people only, where a Hebrew language that is superior and culture that is superior and food and music and everything, and nobody else belongs in that equation. This is just not going to be possible. Within all Israeli elections, at least the last 5, 6 of them, Palestine, Palestinian state, settlements, Jerusalem, nobody is disagreeing. They are all more or less at the same page. They all believe in the expansion of the settlements. They don't believe in a peace process or Palestinian state. There is no peace camp in Israel, and that's Israel's problem. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, they managed to do the following. Number one, they have managed to defeat the Israeli military machine along with all the support that comes from the United States and everywhere else in the world. And by doing so, they have defeated the idea of Israel as a settler colonial state. Israel has no military way out of or military victory in Gaza. It's just not going to happen. And those of us who have been reporting on the progress of Palestinian resistance from Qassam 1 back in decades ago that reached literally 1 kilometer, and it was indeed, a lot of people continue to use the term fireworks in referring to Palestinian rockets, but they are stuck on Qassam 1. It was really fireworks. But now we are talking about the type of rockets and missiles can reach pretty much anywhere in Israel. And the Palestinian fighter, ounce for ounce, I would argue, is the best fighter in the world today. If Israel loses Gaza or loses the war in Gaza, and it will lose the war in Gaza, there is going to be no wars in Gaza for a long time. The same thing is going to happen in Lebanon. Hezbollah, as of yesterday, for example, began using the kind of drones that Israel did not even know existed. Attack drones, the type of drones that can actually carry missiles and do the kind of things that the Israelis did not count on. And now they have also developed anti-defense systems that they can actually shoot at Israeli airplanes and that sort of. So Lebanon is not an easy option. What is the soft belly of the Palestinian people, the West Bank. Not because the West Bankers are not strong fighters, but because the Palestinian Authority has worked with Israel for so many years to eliminate the grassroots infrastructure of these fighters, keeping them in very small and isolated areas, particularly Jenin, Tulkarem, Nablus, Balata, and that sort of thing. So if Israel loses the war in Gaza, I think what is going to happen, they are going to go to the West Bank. And I think we are going to start hearing about the annexations again, because they need to save face. They need to, well, I mean, we are already shamed. We are already a pariah state. We are already a genocidal regime and baby killers. Most likely they will be dubbed as baby killers by the upcoming report by the United Nations, or we are all of these things. So we have no reputation to protect anyway. So why don't we just go all the way to the West Bank and implement the annexation plan that is already existing as a de facto? I mean, it's already there. The West Bank, or vast majority of the West Bank, is annexed, and even the areas like Ramallah and elsewhere that are under, supposedly under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, the Israelis can go in and out, arrest, kill, do whatever. So all of the West Bank, as far as annexation is concerned, is de facto annexation. They have always wanted to do the de jure annexation. They wanted to make it legally annexed as part of so-called Israel proper. And I think this is going to be their opportunity, because the Palestinian Authority is extremely weak. And by the way, this is why, in my opinion, Netanyahu does not want the PA to be involved in Gaza in any way. Unlike what Gallant and others are saying, say, get the PA involved. Even if the PA involved just between the two of us, nothing is going to happen. The Gaza has no mood to compromise with Mahmoud Abbas and his intelligence. But the reason that the Israelis don't want this to happen, because they are planning a fight in the West Bank. They are going to go after the West Bank, and they are going to try to annex, and they are going to go, and there's going to be a lot of violence in the West Bank in order for them to distract from their defeat in Gaza. That the war hasn't stopped. We finished with Rafah. Now we need to go to Jenin and Tulkarem, but this time we are going to take over in the entirety of the northern West Bank. I think that's the Israeli plan. This is why it's very important what we are doing at the international level. I think solidarity with the Palestinians has never been more consequential. Prior to that, it was just part of grassroots building. One day we are going to create that critical mass that is going to shame and marginalize Israel and make Israel a pariah state, pushing any potential for a peace camp in Israel to become empowered enough to make a change and sit with the Palestinians and make a deal. What the solidarity that's happening right now is beyond all of this. There is an existential war that is being fought against the Palestinian people. It's either there will be Palestinian people living in that part of the world or not. So solidarity has to be as strong as humanly possible. And people have to become aware now, not later. And they have to take action now, not later, because this is the kind of war that we are fighting. And I think the war will sooner or later move to the West Bank, because Israel will not allow the West Bank to be inspired by Gaza and to start building its own Qassam, type of resistance to launch a warfare against Israel, especially that the illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank are inside the West Bank. They're not at the border. They are not at the West Bank envelope. They are within the West Bank itself. This is where I think the war is going to be heading next.
And I think being conscious of time here, this might be a good place to end on. Exactly in that post-war setting that you described, what do you see a post-war Gaza being?
I haven't actually announced this publicly, but with Professor Ilan Pape, we are writing a book in which the title is going to be called Gaza Rising. Even the publisher who agreed to publish the book was a little bit confused about the title, Gaza Rising. What does that mean? Gaza is in ashes. How could someone in ashes how could you even propose that Gaza could be rising under these circumstances? But there is a component in political analysis that we don't talk about. We Palestinians talk about it increasingly so because we apply the academic tools of positionality and such. that element is something that it cannot be measured through firepower, not the number of tanks or missiles or rockets or the number of soldiers or fighters. It is something that happens at a whole different level. And for Palestinians, the concept of sumud, steadfastness, karama, dignity, muthabara, how do you translate muthabara? The quest to always better yourself, to move forward. I remember visiting Gaza after the 2012 war, and I wanted to see the damage that happened as a result of the war, but I couldn't. What I found is that they took the concrete of the destroyed building and they crushed them into new concrete and rebuilt even more beautiful buildings. These people have the kind of spirit that it's so legendary that it's just even it is difficult to fathom, let alone understand. I think Gaza will rise. And I think the power that allowed the people to withstand all of this and to fight under all of these circumstances and under all these obstacles and hardships, being watched at any given second by hundreds of American, Israeli, British, French, and Italian drones, and yet to withstand and to win, I think the task of rebuilding Gaza is not going to be the hardest of tasks. So Gaza will be rebuilt. Just one last thing I want to say about this. There was a video that was going viral on social media of someone taking a video out of his balcony or his window of a neighborhood, I think it was in Jabalia, that was completely destroyed. And I thought the camera is just basically kind of spanning over just the degree of destruction, but he was zooming in on a father and his daughter who are somewhere kind of tucked in within all this rubble. And he was building the tiles of a destroyed house. The house is completely gone, but he has this perfectly small square of new tiles. His daughter is handing him the tiles, and he is hammering and trying to make sure that it's perfectly level. Everything else in that neighborhood was gone, destroyed several times over, pulverized. He is so impatient that he's not waiting for the war to end. He's trying to rebuild his house now. Gaza will be rebuilt. What matters is for the Gazans to stay home so that there is no another Nakba and for Israel to be militarily defeated. This is why Netanyahu is prolonging the war, and this is the outcome that he will never get under any circumstance.
Ramzy, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for your time. And we hope to have a even more expanded conversation, perhaps in the future as things develop. And thank you.
Thanks for having me, Robert.